The ship that arrived at Messina in October 1447, everyone knows the image. Sailors dead at the oars, or nearly dead, covered in black swellings the size of eggs. The chroniclers describe it in that specific physical detail that makes it vivid 8 centuries later. What almost nobody knows is where the thing on that ship actually came from. And the answer to that question is stranger and more recent than you'd expect.
There is a cemetery outside Bishkek, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, called Kyrgyz. The tombstones there are carved in Syriac script. This was a Nestorian Christian community, a branch of Christianity that had spread east along the Silk Road trade routes, and by the 14th century maintained large, established populations across Central Asia, deep in the interior of Central Asia. Part of the networks of trade and travel that the Mongol peace had opened, the roughly century-long period of political stability across Eurasia under Mongol rule, that, for the first time, connected the eastern coast of China to the western coast of Europe in a single administrative and commercial system. Two of those tombstones, from 1338 and 1339, carry an unusual notation: not died of fever, not died in winter. The Syriac inscription reads, died of pestilence. The word is specific. The carvers knew they were marking something different.
And what's remarkable about those tombstones is that they sat in a published archaeological record for decades. They were first documented in the 1880s, and nobody connected them to the Black Death origin question until recently. It took ancient DNA sequencing from 2022 to establish what those carvings were actually pointing at.
The Nature paper published in 2022, sequencing genomes from the skeletal remains at Kyrgyz and a nearby site called Burana, found Yersinia pestis DNA, and not just any variant. The genomes represent what the researchers describe as the most recent common ancestor of the Black Death lineage. The divergence date, with 95% statistical confidence, falls between 1308 and 1345. That range places the origin squarely in Central Asia in the generation before the epidemic reached Europe. The debate about where the Black Death came from, and it was a genuine academic debate with multiple competing hypotheses, is, at least in its broad outline, resolved. It came from here, from these mountains, from this specific community.
And the environmental context matters because diseases don't emerge in a vacuum. The Tian Shan region, the mountain range that runs through what's now Kyrgyzstan and into western China, was hit with severe drought in the years immediately before those tombstones were carved. 1339 was 36% below average rainfall. That's not a bad year. That's a catastrophe for the semi-arid ecosystems where plague reservoirs live in rodent populations. When those rodent populations crash, or when food scarcity pushes them towards human settlements, the flea populations that move between rodents and humans move with them.
The burial goods recovered at Kyrgyz tell you something essential about why a disease emerging in the Tian Shan in 1338 could reach Sicily in 1347. Among the objects interred with the dead, goods from the Mediterranean, from India, from the Pacific, from China. This was not an isolated community. It was a node in that same trade network. The same infrastructure that moved silk and spices and silver moved eventually infected fleas.
And then there's the story of how it actually crossed from Central Asia to Europe, which is where things get complicated, because the story most people know, the one that shows up in textbooks, the one that gets called the first act of biological warfare in history, is almost certainly not true.
The siege of Caffa, the Genoese trading port on the Crimean coast. The Mongol army of Johnny Bek, which had been besieging the city and which, when plague broke out in its ranks, catapulted the infected corpses over the walls. The Genoese ships fleeing with the disease already aboard, carrying it west to Constantinople, then to Messina, then to every port in the Mediterranean. It's a dramatic and specific origin story, and it rests on exactly one source.
One source.
A notary named Gabriele de Musi, writing in the city of Piacenza in northern Italy. He describes the catapults in vivid detail, the bodies flying over the walls, the stench, the panic among the Genoese defenders. And Hannah Barker's 2021 article in Speculum went looking for Gabriele de Musi in the archival record and found him. She found him drawing up legal documents in Piacenza daily through the entire period in question. He was not in Caffa. The archival record places him in Piacenza, drawing up legal documents through the entire period he claims to be describing. Whatever he wrote about the catapults, he did not see them.
Which doesn't mean the siege didn't happen. It means the eyewitness account of what happened at the siege was written by someone who was not an eyewitness to anything.
What Barker argues, and this is the more careful version of the origin story, is that the actual transmission vector across the Black Sea was not catapulted corpses, but the resumption of ordinary commerce. There had been roughly a year of trade embargoes following the conflict at Caffa. When peace was restored in 1347, grain ships began moving again. Ships carrying, as they always did, rats. Rats carrying, as plague-endemic rodent populations do, infected fleas. The mechanism was mundane, not a weapon, not a siege tactic, just the ordinary machinery of medieval trade re-engaging after a period of interruption.
The mundane version is somehow more disturbing than the catapult story, because the catapult story implies an agent, a decision, a moment where things could have gone differently. The mundane version says this was always going to happen. The trade network that connected Kyrgyzstan to Genoa was going to carry whatever moved through Kyrgyzstan to Genoa, eventually.
And the speed at which it moved once it reached the Mediterranean is the thing that tells you something was genuinely unusual about this pathogen, whatever it was.
And those numbers compound in a way that's hard to hold in your head. 1 mile per day overland, which sounds slow until you realize it's 24 miles per day by sea. And across a continent full of coastline, that means it could be in your city before the messenger sent to warn you had saddled his horse.
Those numbers come from reconstructions based on the documented arrival dates in city after city across Europe. Historians have tracked when the disease appeared in specific locations and worked backward to map the velocity. And the numbers are consistent enough across different regions, different years, different researchers, that they're probably close to right. What they tell you is that by sea, this thing could cross the Mediterranean in a matter of weeks. By land, it was slower, but it moved. It got into the mountain villages of Switzerland and the interior of Germany and the highland parishes of Scotland. It did not stay on the coast.
The 43-day doubling time is the number I keep returning to, because that's the number that turns a local outbreak into a continental catastrophe. You start with 1 infected community, and in 6 weeks you have 2. In 12 weeks you have 4. In 18 weeks you have 8. By the time the doubling is visible, you're already 8 steps into the sequence, and step 8 looks nothing like step 1.
What makes that doubling rate particularly significant is what it implies about transmission. Modern bubonic plague, the disease caused by Yersinia pestis, in the 20th century, the outbreak in Bombay in 1896 and 1897, does not spread like this, not remotely. The bacterium in the graves is Yersinia pestis. The DNA is unambiguous. That part is settled. And yet, the behavior of the 14th century epidemic contradicts, in nearly every measurable parameter, the behavior of Yersinia pestis in documented modern outbreaks.
Samuel Cohn laid this out systematically, and the argument has 5 distinct pieces, none of which have been convincingly refuted.
The speed of spread is one. Modern bubonic plague moves slowly. It requires rat populations to establish local reservoirs before human cases multiply. The 14th century disease moved 2 orders of magnitude faster than that would allow. The second is direct person-to-person transmission. Every contemporary chronicler, and they wrote about this in extraordinary detail because they were terrified and paying close attention, described the defining characteristic of the Black Death as its person-to-person contagion. Touch a sick person and you became sick. Attend the dying and you died. In Bombay in 1896 and 1897, medical officers reported that attending plague wards produced virtually no secondary infections among the attending staff, a rate so low that some investigators described it as negligible. That is not a small discrepancy.
And nobody connects these two things as directly as they should. The ancient DNA confirms Y. pestis. The epidemiology contradicts Y. pestis. Both are true simultaneously, and the synthesis explaining how that's possible doesn't exist yet.
The third point Cohn raises is seasonality. Bubonic plague's primary vector, the rat flea Xenopsilla cheops, is most active in warm, humid conditions. The 14th century epidemic killed most aggressively in cool, dry conditions. The seasonal pattern runs almost exactly backwards. The fourth is the description of the skin lesions. Contemporary accounts described lesions that were more deadly than the swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, and that presented differently from anything in the modern clinical literature on Y. pestis infection. And the fifth, which is perhaps the most striking, across 5 centuries of European documentation, across thousands of surviving chronicles, account books, municipal records, and private letters, there is not a single reference to rats dying in large numbers. Not one. Mass rat mortality is the visible, dramatic precondition for a major bubonic plague outbreak, because the fleas flee the cooling rat corpses and seek human hosts. Medieval Europeans noticed everything. They noticed unusual cloud formations and aberrant animal behavior, and they wrote it down. They did not see rats dying, because the rats were not dying.
Which is a real problem if your story requires rats as the primary vector.
It is a very serious problem. And the honest position, which the research community has not fully settled into, is that the ancient DNA evidence establishes that Y. pestis was present. It does not establish that Y. pestis alone explains the epidemic's behavior. The pathogen we can identify in the graves may have been operating in conjunction with something else, or it may have had characteristics in the 14th century that its modern descendants no longer have, or the epidemiological reconstructions may be wrong in ways nobody has yet identified. The question is genuinely open.
And the modern version of this problem, where you have a confirmed pathogen identity, but behavior that the confirmed identity doesn't fully explain, is one of the recurring situations in infectious disease science. The assumption that you've identified the thing is almost always correct, and almost never the end of the story.
What we can say with confidence is this. Whatever was moving through those ships from Sicily moved like nothing European populations had encountered. And the question of why later outbreaks of the same disease through the same centuries became progressively less lethal, that answer is equally strange and almost universally misunderstood.
Because the explanation everyone reaches for is human immunity. We survived, we adapted. The survivors passed on something that made their descendants more resistant.
That explanation is biologically false. Humans cannot acquire long-term immunity to Y. pestis. The mechanism by which later waves killed fewer people was not human adaptation at all. It was rat adaptation. Rats, in the populations most repeatedly exposed to plague, developed resistance to the bacterium. When rats become resistant, Flea populations remain on the rats rather than fleeing to human hosts, and the transmission pathway to humans weakens. The decline in European plague mortality over 3 centuries was driven by a species that medieval Europeans were actively trying to exterminate precisely because they believed, correctly, that rats were connected to plague. The irony runs all the way through. The intervention that worked was killing rats, and the reason it worked was not the reason anyone thought it worked.
The thing that's worth sitting with there is what it says about the relationship between the right action and the right explanation. Florence's municipal government in 1348 implemented quarantine measures and sanitation protocols. Those measures reduced mortality. The theory behind them, miasma, bad air, spiritual corruption, was entirely wrong. The practice was right. And the distinction between those two things, between effective action and correct understanding, is one of the genuinely difficult problems in how human institutions respond to catastrophe.
The Decameron captures this precisely, and not by accident. Boccaccio's frame, 10 young people retreating to a country villa, organizing their own community, telling each other stories, managing their days by collective agreement rather than clerical authority, was not merely a literary device. It was a description of exactly the kind of rational, secular, self-organized response that his contemporary municipal government in Florence was, with genuine effectiveness, attempting. The church was offering prayer. The city was offering quarantine. Boccaccio noticed which one was keeping people alive.
And that's still true today in exactly the way that matters. The gap between institutional authority and institutional competence is always most visible at moments of acute crisis, because crisis is when the gap has immediate, measurable consequences. You can paper over that gap for decades in ordinary times. You cannot paper over it when people are dying at a rate that doubles every 6 weeks.
The number that brings this into focus, the mortality figure, is itself one of the most contested numbers in medieval history. 1/3 of Europe is the version most people know. It is a teaching convenience. The actual scholarly range runs from 30% to 60%, with the hardest-hit regions, southern France, Italy, England, the Iberian Peninsula, almost certainly above 50%. A 2024 paper in Demographic Research attacked the methodology underlying all these estimates directly, arguing that the growth rate discontinuity method, which compares pre-plague and post-plague population trajectories to infer mortality, misestimates death tolls by large, unpredictable margins, because it requires baseline population data for 14th century Europe, which does not exist. The method's own inventors acknowledged it cannot be considered informative when you don't have reliable population numbers to begin with, which is exactly the situation in 14th century Europe.
So the number everyone cites is built on a method that doesn't work, applied to data that doesn't exist.
What we have instead of a precise figure is a landscape of local evidence. Specific manors, specific parishes, specific towns where the documentary record, wills, tax rolls, court proceedings, property transfers, allows a localized reconstruction. In some English villages, the evidence suggests 60% mortality within a 2-year window. In some regions of France, grain production records imply labor losses consistent with half or more of the agricultural workforce. The aggregate is uncertain. The local evidence, where it survives, is often staggering.
And even the range, 30% to 60%, contains a distinction that alters the entire interpretation of what comes after. Because 30% is a catastrophe that a social order can, over time, absorb. 60% is a different kind of event entirely. At 60% mortality, you're not losing workers. You're losing the knowledge of how to do the work. You're losing the oral transmission of craft skills, agricultural technique, legal precedent, local custom, things that live in people and die with them.
The document that survives from one English manor, and this detail appears in the estate records rather than the chronicles, is a list of tenants with no notation of heirs, not died intestate, not died without issue, simply a name and then a blank where the next generation should be. The record-keeping continued. The people it was recording were gone.
Which sets up the question that everything from here forward depends on. We know roughly how fast it moved, roughly how many it killed, roughly where it came from, though with uncertainty at every point. What we don't yet know is what a civilization does in the years immediately after losing, in some places, more than half its people. How the institutions that were already bending, the ones we spent Act 1 watching, actually broke, or didn't.
And which direction the pieces fell.
This is Pulse, Origins, produced by Singularity Pulse Network. Views expressed are our own. New episodes every Sunday. Follow us on @thepulsespn on X, the Everything app.
I'm Caden. The Pulse Brief is every weekday, 10 minutes. AI, space, crypto, cybersecurity, what matters most today? Find it wherever you listen.
I'm Knox. Every Saturday on Pulse Deep Dive, one story, the history, the present, and what comes next. Find it wherever you listen.